The Grand Deliberation Hall was one of the oldest structures in known space. It floated in orbit around a dying red star, its metal bones older than most civilizations that had ever sat inside it. 47 species had sent their representatives here over thousands of years to argue, to vote, to decide the fate of whole worlds. The hall had seen wars declared and wars ended. It had seen species rise to power and others quietly disappear from the records. It was a serious place, built by serious minds for serious business. That is why what happened on the day Ambassador Thessery spoke was so strange. Because the Grand Deliberation Hall had never, in all its long history, heard so much laughter. Thessery was old by Vreth standards. Her 4 eyes were pale and clouded at the edges, and the dark blue skin of her face had grown thin over the bones beneath. She had spent 31 years on a small, wet, noisy planet called Earth. 31 years watching. 31 years taking notes. 31 years feeling a slow and growing unease that she could not fully explain, even to herself. When she had finally sent her request to address the full council, she had done so with shaking hands. She stood now, at the center of the hall, on the speaking platform of pale stone, surrounded on all sides by the curved rows of seats rising up and away from her, like the inside of a great bowl. Every seat was filled. The air smelled of 47 different atmospheres, processed and mixed into something breathable by the station's old systems. The light was gray and even, the kind of light that made everything look important. Thessery looked out at the faces around her. Compound eyes, smooth featureless membranes, clusters of sensory stalks, things that could only loosely be called faces at all, and she began to speak. She told them about the humans. She told them that the humans were small. Smaller than most species at this table. They had no natural armor. Their bones broke easily. Their skin was thin and soft, and offered almost no protection from the environment. They had no claws worth speaking of, no venom, no psychic ability, no connection to any known energy field. They were, by every biological measure, a fragile species that should not have survived long enough to invent the wheel, let alone space travel. And yet, she told the council about the first time she had seen a human laugh at a disaster. She had been in a city called Lagos, observing a festival, when a sudden and violent storm had rolled in from the ocean. The rain had come down so hard that visibility dropped to almost nothing. The streets flooded in minutes. The festival was ruined. Every reasonable being would have seen this as a loss, an occasion for sadness or frustration. The humans had laughed. They had taken off their shoes and waded into the floodwater and laughed. Children had jumped into the deeper pools while their parents watched and laughed. An old man had sat down in the middle of a flooded street and laughed until he cried, and then kept laughing. She told the council about the machines, about a small wheeled explorer the humans had sent to a neighboring planet many generations before they achieved space travel. It was a simple thing, powered by sunlight, moving slowly across red dust and rocks. It was not alive. It could not speak. It could not feel. When it finally stopped working, when its power faded and its signal went silent, the humans held a vigil. They gathered in large groups. They played a song. Some of them cried. They had named it. They had loved it, and it could not love them back. She told the council about a practice called warfare, which humans had engaged in for most of their recorded history. The violence itself was not unusual. Many species had warlike periods. What was unusual was the rest of it. The humans had, even during their most brutal wars, written poetry, painted pictures, sent letters home. They had made jokes in the trenches and sung songs in the dark, and then gone out the next morning and fought again. They did not separate the feeling from the doing. They carried both at once. She told the council about the animals. Humans shared their planet with millions of other species, and for centuries they had been pushing many of those species toward extinction. But then, Something had shifted. They had begun to feel bad about it. Not as a policy, not as a logical calculation about ecosystem value. They had felt bad, and so they had built shelters for sick animals and spent vast resources trying to save species that had no practical use to them. They had cried over animals they had never met. They had traveled to the other side of the world to count birds. She paused there and looked around the hall. "I am not here to tell you that humans are violent," she said. "You already know that every species capable of reaching space has passed through violence. I am not here to tell you they are dishonest or greedy or primitive. I am here to tell you something harder to explain." She took a slow breath. "They feel everything, all of it, all at once, all the time. And it doesn't stop them. It doesn't slow them down. They grieve, and then they build. They fail, and then they laugh. They lose people they love, and then they love more people. There is no bottom to it. There is no point at which they are used up." She let the silence sit for a moment. "I have watched them for 31 years, and I am here to tell you with full respect for this body, that they should not be admitted into the Accord. Not because they will harm us, but because they will change us in ways we cannot predict and cannot reverse. Because they do not operate by any logic I have been able to map. Because they are the only species I have ever studied that I cannot model. I do not know what they want. I do not know what they fear. I only know that when they fall, they get back up smiling." She stepped back from the speaking stone. There was a moment of silence, and then the laughter started. It began in the upper rows, where the Felhari delegation sat. The Felhari were known for being quick to amusement, and the sound of their laughter was a high clicking sound, like stones rattling in a metal box. It spread quickly. The Doren beside them began their low rolling chuckle. The Vresi, 3 rows up, made the whistling sound that served them as laughter. Soon, nearly every delegation in the hall was making whatever sound their species used for amusement, and the Grand Deliberation Hall, oldest serious structure in known space, was full of it. Thessaris stood on the platform and waited for it to stop. It took a while. When the president of the council finally called the hall back to order, he was still smiling in the way his species smiled, which involved all 4 of his upper jaw segments rising together. He thanked Thessari for her report, and noted that the Vreth had always had a gift for dramatic presentation. The laughter started again, softer this time. The vote was called. Humanity's provisional membership in the Galactic Accord passed with 44 votes in favor and 3 against. Thessari did not vote. She sat in her seat, with her 4 pale eyes, looking at nothing, her hands still in her lap. After the session, she submitted a formal request for emergency asylum on a neutral station. She requested the station be located as far from human space as practical. No one asked her why. On Earth, when the news came through, there were parades, there were fireworks and speeches and crying and music. Strangers embraced each other in the streets of cities on every continent. Someone baked a cake the size of a building. The celebrations lasted for 3 days. In the Grand Deliberation Hall, the session minutes were filed, stamped, and sent to the archive. No one reread them. No one noticed the final line of Thessari's report, still sitting unread in the document, which said simply, "I am not warning you because I think they are monsters. I am warning you because I have never met anything so completely, unstoppably, dangerously alive." 30 years passed. The Galactic Accord had seen new species join before. It was always the same pattern. A new species would arrive, nervous and wide-eyed, and spend the first decade trying to figure out the rules. The second decade, they would start making small mistakes. The third decade, they would begin to find their footing. It was slow. It was expected. The Accord was a large and complicated thing, and learning to live inside it took time. Humanity did not follow the pattern. Within 5 years of joining, human traders were operating in 17 different star systems. Within 10 years, they had opened diplomatic offices in 32 member states. Within 15 years, there was not a single species in the Accord that had not in some way been touched by human contact. They traded goods that no one had thought to trade before. They offered services that no one had known they needed. They showed up at funerals for species that had not invited them, and somehow no one was offended. They asked questions that other species found rude, and then apologized so genuinely that the offense evaporated. They were everywhere. Council members began to joke, privately, that humanity moved through the Accord like water finding cracks. Not aggressive, not loud, just constant. Always moving, always filling spaces, always present. Some found it charming, some found it exhausting. A small number found it deeply unsettling, though they could not explain why. The humans also volunteered for the dangerous work. The Accord had what were called buffer zone assignments, patrol and peacekeeping duties along the borders between member states that had bad history with each other. These assignments were unpopular because they were boring most of the time and extremely dangerous the rest of the time. Most species contributed the minimum required number of ships and personnel and hoped nothing would happen. Humans volunteered for double shifts. When asked why, a human commander named Delroy Hutchins gave an answer that was passed around council administrative offices for years afterward. He had shrugged and said, "Someone has to stand in the middle. Might as well be us. We're good at awkward situations." There was also the matter of the children. Border conflicts between Accord member states happened regularly. Small wars, mostly. Skirmishes over resources or old grudges. These conflicts always left behind the same wreckage: damaged infrastructure, displaced populations, and children with no one to take them home. Most species in the Accord had formal processes for dealing with displaced children, which meant they were registered, housed in facilities, and waited in line for bureaucratic resolution. Humans took them home, not through any formal program. Individual human families, stationed in conflict zones or working nearby, would simply bring children back with them. A Doren child with copper-colored scales and 3 eyes would appear in a human school in a city called Nairobi, surrounded by human children who did not find this strange at all. A Vresi infant, thin and 4-limbed, and completely unlike any human child in any visible way, would be photographed sleeping in the arms of a human woman who looked at it the way humans looked at things they had decided to love completely. The Accord did not know what to do with this. There were no regulations for it, because no one had thought regulations would be needed. Then came the Kreth. The Kreth Empire was not the most powerful force in the Accord, but they were aggressive in the way that mid-sized powers often are, always looking to push at edges, always testing how much they could take before someone pushed back. They had raided smaller member states a dozen times over the past century. The pattern was always the same. They would hit something small and valuable. The victim would protest. The council would make sounds of disapproval. The Kreth would pay a small fine or make a small gesture of goodwill, and then wait a few years and do it again. They had learned that the Accord had limits to how hard it would push back. The raid on Calder's Reach was supposed to be the same thing. It was a human agricultural world, newly developed, still small. The Kreth sent 4 ships and stripped one of the outer processing facilities of its equipment and stockpiles. They were in and out in 6 hours. They expected protest. They expected a council session. They expected a fine. They received a letter. It was written in formal Accord diplomatic language, politely worded, and it requested the return of the taken equipment, financial compensation for lost product and time, and a formal acknowledgement of the violation. It gave the Kreth 30 days to respond. The Kreth did not respond. The 30 days passed. And then, very quietly, things began to change. A human trading consortium informed two of its Kreth-adjacent partners that it would be renegotiating contract terms. A human-backed infrastructure project near Kreth space was paused for a review of contractor eligibility. A species called the Mori, who relied heavily on a shipping lane that passed through human-friendly territory, received a gentle note suggesting that certain Kreth-affiliated vessels might face new inspection requirements that could cause delays. No one fired a shot. No human warship moved. No emergency council session was called. Within 4 months, the Kreth found that doing business in a third of the Accord had become quietly, stubbornly, maddening difficult. Nothing was blocked outright. Everything just took longer, cost more, required more paperwork, needed more approvals. It was bureaucratic, slow, and utterly suffocating. The Kreth paid the compensation. They returned what equipment they still had. They issued the formal acknowledgement. The trading consortium cheerfully resumed its contracts the following week. What happened next was more important than the reparations. It spread, not a rumor, but a feeling, a shift in how the Accord thought about humans. Other species began to quietly review their own histories with humanity. They counted the favors, they counted the volunteers, they counted the children taken in, and the funerals attended, and the dangerous patrols covered. They began to understand that the water filling the cracks had also, slowly and without announcement, become load-bearing. A senior archivist in the Council's Records Division, an old Duran named Sivith, was assigned to review old warning filings as part of a routine audit. She pulled the Sari's original report because it was flagged as unresolved. The asylum request had never been formally closed. She read the full document for the first time. She read it slowly. She read it twice. When she reached the final line, she sat back in her chair and stared at the wall of her small office for a long time. Then she sent a note to her supervisor, attaching the document, with a single line of her own added at the bottom. It said, "I think we should have read this more carefully." Her supervisor read it, filed it under low priority review, and went to lunch. Somewhere on the other side of known space, a human crew on a buffer zone patrol ship was eating together in a small common room, laughing at something one of them had said. Outside the viewport, the dark between two enemy borders stretched in every direction. They had been here for 8 months. They had 6 more to go. None of them had asked to leave early. No one knew exactly when the Selen Dominion had first appeared. The oldest Accord records mention them only briefly, in the notes of an explorer who had ventured past the mapped edges of known space almost 400 years ago. The explorer had described a vast and silent empire, ancient beyond easy calculation, with no interest in contact. The Selen had not attacked the explorer. They had simply transmitted a single message in a language the explorer could not read, and then closed their borders and gone silent. They had stayed silent for 4 centuries. When they finally spoke again, the Accord was not prepared for what they said. The Selen transmitted on all open council frequencies simultaneously. Their message was long and precise and written in perfect Accord standard, which meant they had been listening for years without anyone knowing. They described the Accord as a failed experiment in sentimental governance. They said that every war in Accord history, every famine, every collapse of a member state, every bad decision made in the past 1,000 years could be traced back to one root cause, species that allowed feeling to override logic. They said they had a better way. They called it the rational order. No feelings, no bias, no grief, no joy. Pure calculation applied to every decision, from resource allocation to military action. They had been living this way for 2,000 years. They had no poverty. They had no war within their own borders. They had no crime. They had, they said, optimized themselves into something better than what they had been before. They offered membership in the Rational Order to any Accord species willing to accept the terms. The terms were simple. You followed Selene logic. You cut out the rest. Several small and exhausted species, ground down by decades of Accord politics and border conflicts and the endless complicated business of feeling things, quietly accepted. The Accord called emergency sessions. There were speeches, there were resolutions, there was a great deal of noise that accomplished very little. The Selene continued their slow, quiet expansion. Through all of this, humanity watched. They sent observers to the border regions where Selene influence was growing. They read the reports. They talked to the species who were considering defection. They did not make speeches. They made meals and sat with people and listened. They offered help with small practical problems. Infrastructure repairs, medical supplies, trade renegotiations, without asking for anything back. Some species stayed in the Accord because of those meals. Some stayed because a human engineer spent 3 weeks fixing their water systems without being asked. Some stayed because a human doctor sat with a dying elder and held their hand, whatever shape that hand happened to be. The Selene noted all of this. They filed detailed reports. They ran calculations. They determined that humanity was the single greatest obstacle to rational order expansion, not because of military power, but because of what they called contamination, the spreading of irrational emotional behavior to otherwise stable civilizations. Everywhere humans went, things got messy and warm and complicated and harder to predict. Everywhere humans went, species started making decisions based on how they felt, rather than what was optimal. The Selene found this intolerable. Then their ship went down near the edge of human space. It was an exploration vessel, long range, crew of 11. A navigational error, rare but not impossible, even for a species that prided itself on perfect calculation, sent the ship into a debris field at the wrong speed. The hull damage was severe. 3 crew members were dead before the distress systems even activated. The remaining 8 were alive, but the ship was losing atmosphere and would be completely uninhabitable within 40 hours. Selene protocol in this situation was precise. A damaged vessel in hostile or unknown territory was to be considered lost. Sending a rescue ship would expose a second vessel to unknown risk. The logical calculation was simple. 8 lives were not worth the potential loss of a rescue crew and ship. The survivors were expected to use their remaining time to transmit all scientific data collected during the mission before power failed completely. They began transmitting. The human patrol vessel that picked up the distress signal was not a military ship. It was a small survey craft called the Meridian Cross, carrying a crew of 9, led by a captain named Yara Osei. She was 38 years old, from a city on the western coast of the African continent, and she had been in space for 12 years. She heard the distress signal, checked her charts, saw that no Selene rescue was incoming, and turned her ship toward the debris field without calling for authorization. Her first officer pointed out that the Selene had not requested assistance. Yara said that people were dying and the paperwork could happen later. Getting to the damaged vessel was not easy. The debris field was thick and unpredictable. It took 4 hours of careful maneuvering, 2 hull scrapes, and 1 moment where everyone on the Meridian Cross held their breath and waited to see if they were going to die. They did not die. They reached the Selene ship, sealed an emergency connection between the 2 hulls, and began moving the survivors across. The 8 surviving Selene were thin, pale creatures taller than humans, with flat, expressionless faces and large, dark eyes that showed nothing. They did not speak during the transfer. They did not resist. They did not help. They moved where they were guided and sat where they were placed and stared at the humans around them with those large, dark eyes as if studying a new and confusing species of insect. Yara's crew fed them. treated their injuries, gave them warm places to rest. One of the crew members, a young man named Tomas, sat with the most badly injured Selene survivor for 6 hours because the medical system needed monitoring and he did not want her to be alone while it ran. She did not speak to him. He talked anyway, quietly, about nothing important. About a river near his hometown, about a dog he had once had, about the way certain stars looked from certain angles. She survived. When the Meridian Cross delivered the 8 survivors to the nearest Selene border station, there was no ceremony, no gratitude. The Selene took their people, ran a medical scan on each one, and transmitted a receipt of transfer, as if the humans had delivered a package. Then they transmitted a formal statement to the Accord, calling the rescue an act of irrational interference in Selene internal affairs, and describing it as, in their precise language, an affront to rational civilization. Yara read the statement in her captain's chair. She sat with it for a moment. Then she asked her crew if anyone wanted to send a response. After some discussion, they pooled their personal food stores and assembled a care package. Various preserved foods from Earth, a handwritten note from Tomas wishing the injured survivor a full recovery, and a round cake that one of the crew had baked in the ship's small galley. It was transmitted to the Selene border station with a polite cover message. The Selene did not respond, but deep inside their sealed empire, in a chamber where 11 members of the High Directorate sat around a table made of a single piece of cold white stone, the reports were read, and the calculations were run again and again. They kept arriving at the same answer. The humans had gained nothing from the rescue. There was no strategic benefit, no trade angle, no political leverage. The math did not work. They ran it again. Still nothing. The eldest member of the Directorate, who had not spoken in the session, finally said 4 words that were recorded in Selene archives as the beginning of the end. They cannot be modeled. The table was silent for a long time after that. Outside, the empire stretched in every direction, cold and orderly and vast. Inside, 11 minds that had long ago cut out everything they called weakness, sat with a feeling they no longer had a word for. It felt, though none of them would ever say so, something like fear. The lie was beautiful. That was the word the Council's own information analysts used when they studied it later, after everything had already fallen apart. Beautiful. They did not mean it as a compliment. They meant it the way you might call a very deep wound clean. Precise, cold, and terrible in how well it was made. The Selene had spent years building it. They had gathered real records, real human diplomatic communications, real trade agreements, real personal messages, and woven between them a small number of fabricated documents so perfectly constructed that no standard verification system in the Accord could tell the difference. The fabricated documents told a story, a long, quiet, patient story. They showed humanity planning from almost the very beginning to use kindness as a tool, to use favors as debt, to use adopted children as loyalty anchors, to use every meal given, every patrol covered, every disaster response, every act of warmth, as an investment. A slow and careful buying of influence that would one day, the documents suggested, allow humanity to control the Accord from the inside, without ever firing a single shot. The Selene released everything at once, to every news system, every council archive, every private diplomatic channel simultaneously. It worked the way a fire works in a dry field. It did not need to be pushed. It just moved. The reaction across the Accord was not uniform. Some species looked at the documents and immediately said they did not believe them. But they were quieter than the ones who did believe. And loudness has always mattered more than certainty in large political bodies. The Felhari, who had laughed the loudest in the deliberation hall all those years ago, now called for an immediate suspension of human voting rights, pending investigation. The Mori, whose shipping lanes had been gently rerouted during the Kreth situation, suddenly remembered how that had felt, and called it proof of exactly the kind of manipulation the documents described. The council voted to open a formal investigation into humanity's conduct as an Accord member. 44 votes in favor, 3 against. The same numbers as the day they had voted to let humanity in. The human ambassador to the council was a tall, quiet woman named Priya Anand. She had served in the role for 9 years. She was known for being calm in difficult sessions, and for bringing very good tea to private negotiations, which sounds like a small thing, but had in practice resolved 3 separate trade disputes. When the vote result was read, she sat in her seat and looked straight ahead for a long moment. Then she requested the floor. She was given it. She told the council that humanity would cooperate fully with the investigation. Not partially, not with conditions, fully. Every communication record going back to their first day of membership, every diplomatic file, every personal log that any human official had kept during their service, every internal document of every human agency that had operated in Accord space. She told them the files would be organized, translated into all 47 council languages, and delivered within 30 days. The hall was quiet. Someone from the Duran delegation said, carefully, that this was a surprising level of cooperation. Priya Anand said that people with nothing to hide found it easier to cooperate than people who spent their time thinking about how things looked. She sat down. The files arrived in 26 days, not 30, 26. They were organized as promised and translated as promised, and they were complete in a way that no investigation team had ever encountered before. Every communication, dated and sourced, every action that had looked like manipulation, laid out with its full context, the actual reasons, the actual conversations, the actual human beings behind each decision, with their actual messy, emotional, uncalculated motivations, laid bare for anyone to read. A Vresi analyst named Queth, assigned to the investigation team, later said that reading through the human files was the strangest work experience of her career. She had expected to find hidden intent. She had expected gaps and careful omissions. Instead, she found arguments. Humans arguing with each other about the right thing to do. Humans changing their minds. Humans making decisions because they felt bad about something, and then second-guessing those decisions. And then feeling bad about the second-guessing. She found a message between 2 human diplomats that was entirely about whether it was appropriate to bring food to a grieving Duran official, and if so, what kind of food, and whether showing up at all would seem intrusive, and whether not showing up would seem cold, and how to balance these things. They had brought the food. The Duran official, in a follow-up note buried in the files, had written that it was the kindest thing anyone had done for her that year. Queth filed her preliminary report. It said the documents provided by humanity showed no evidence of coordinated manipulation. It said the Selene materials appeared to contain fabrications. It said she would need more time to complete the full analysis, but that her early findings strongly favored clearing humanity of the charges. By the time the report landed on the Council President's desk, 3 Accord member states had already publicly aligned with the Selene Dominion. 2 more had suspended contact with human representatives. A Selene-backed military coalition had moved ships into a disputed border region that humanity had been quietly helping to stabilize for years. The war did not start with a declaration. It rarely does. It started with a Selene-aligned vessel opening fire on a human medical transport near a small planet called Drevis Point. The medical transport was carrying supplies for a refugee settlement of mixed species, Duran, Vresi, 2 families of Felhari, and a small group of Mori children who had been displaced by earlier border fighting. There were no military personnel on the transport. The transport was destroyed. The human response was not the explosion the Selene had calculated for. There was no immediate strike, no declaration of war broadcast on all channels. What happened instead was quiet and organized and thorough. Human ships began moving, but most of them moved toward civilian populations in conflict zones, not toward enemy positions. Human diplomatic teams reached out simultaneously to every Accord member, ally and unfriendly alike, with a single consistent message. Wherever you stand in this conflict, if your people need evacuation or medical help, we are coming. Several species that had voted for the investigation, that had listened to the Selene documents and felt doubt creep in, watched this response and felt something shift. They had been told humanity's warmth was a tool. They watched humans spend their first military resources protecting the civilians of species that had just voted against them, and the math the Selene had given them stopped working. The Kreth were the biggest surprise. No one asked them. No treaty obligated them. But 3 Kreth warships arrived in the defense corridor near a human station called Outpost Varen, where Selene-aligned forces were massing. The Kreth commander sent a single message to the human station. It said, "You stopped our trade for 4 months over Kaldur's Reach. You were right to do it. Consider this a debt repaid." Then the Kreth ships took up a defensive position and held it. Across the Accord, in different forms and for different reasons, this pattern repeated. Species who owed humans nothing chose a side anyway. Not because of treaties, not because of calculations, because of a meal, or a patrol, or a child taken in, or a hand held in the dark. The Selene had spent years building a perfect logical argument for why humanity could not be trusted. The problem was that the galaxy had already met humans, and it turned out that memory was louder than documents. The war did not end with a great battle. People who had never lived through a long war always imagined it ending that way. One final massive clash, both sides throwing everything they had at each other, and then silence and a winner standing in the smoke. It made for good stories. It was almost never how things actually ended. Wars ended the way fires ended. They ran out of fuel. They lost oxygen. They burned and burned until there was nothing left to burn, and then they stopped. The Selene Dominion ran out of fuel, not because they were defeated on any single battlefield. Their ships were well built, and their tactics were precise, and their calculations about where and when to strike were, in a purely military sense, often correct. They won engagements. They took territory. There were months where the Accord-aligned forces fell back and the Selene advanced, and the maps in council war rooms were covered in markings that made people sit very still and very quiet at the briefing tables. But the Selene had built their entire civilization on the idea that every resource was finite and had to be managed with perfect efficiency. They could calculate how many ships they could afford to lose. They could calculate how long their supply lines could be stretched. They could calculate acceptable casualties and optimal retreat positions, and the exact point at which a campaign became too costly to continue. What they could not calculate was what happened when humanity treated every loss as a reason to try harder. Human industrial output during the war became something that Accord analysts described in official reports using words they had to invent, because the existing vocabulary was not quite sufficient. The humans did not simply replace lost ships. They built more than they had started with. They did not simply reinforce weakened positions. They overhauled them and made them stronger than they had ever been. They did not ration their warmth and their help as resources to be carefully spent. They gave more of it the more the war demanded, as if the emergency was not draining them, but clarifying them. And they kept protecting everyone, even as their own stations took damage and their own people were killed. Human ships were pulling civilians out of conflict zones on both sides of the fight. There were recorded instances of human medics treating wounded Selene-aligned soldiers, not prisoners, not after capture, but in the field, during active combat, because the wounded soldiers were there and needed help. Some of those soldiers, when they recovered, refused to return to their units, not because they were broken, but because something had shifted in them that their commanders could not explain and could not reverse. The Selene called it contamination. They were not entirely wrong. The economic strangulation came last, the way it had come for the Kreth long ago. But this time, it was not the work of one human trading consortium. It was the work of dozens of species acting together, many of them loosely, some of them only partially, but all of them moving in the same general direction. Trade routes closed. Supply contracts were quietly renegotiated. The Selene, who had spent centuries building a self-sufficient empire, found that 400 years of isolation had made them more dependent on external resources than they had calculated. The gaps in their perfect systems began to show. They did not surrender. The Selene were not built for surrender. Instead, they did what they had done 4 centuries ago. They transmitted a message on all frequencies, closed their borders, and went silent. The message was not an apology. The Selene did not do apologies. It was a statement of strategic withdrawal, precise and cold and completely without emotion, as everything they produced was. It acknowledged that the current campaign had not achieved its objectives. It stated that the Dominion was returning to its borders to recalculate. It ended with a line that was discussed in Accord councils and academic papers and quiet conversations for years afterward. It said, "This is not a conclusion. This is a pause. Logic does not tire. Logic does not forget. We will return when you have forgotten us, and we will finish what reason demands." Then the silence. The Accord rebuilt. It was slower than the building that had come before, because things built after damage are always slower and more careful. There were long debates about what the war had revealed, about the fractures that the Selene had found and widened, about the species that had doubted, and the trust that had been broken, and how much of it could be repaired, and how much simply had to be accepted as changed. These debates were hard. Some of them lasted years. Some of them are still going on. Humanity sat in those debates and did not pretend the hard parts were not hard. At one particularly difficult council session, where 3 species were close to leaving the Accord entirely over disagreements that had begun during the war, a human delegate named Okoro sat for 6 hours, saying almost nothing. Then, very late, when the session had ground down to something exhausted and close to collapse, he asked if he could say something small. He said that he had a grandmother who had lived through a war on Earth, a very old war by human standards, and that after the war, she had rebuilt her house with her own hands. He said she had told him once that the hardest part of rebuilding was not the physical work. The hardest part was deciding every single morning that the house was worth building. He said that was the only thing he had to offer. Then he sat down. The session did not collapse. The 3 species stayed. The formal designation came 6 months after the last Selene ship crossed back inside its own borders. The council voted to recognize humanity not as a provisional member, not as a standard member, but as a founding anchor species. The designation was new. They had created it specifically because no existing category was sufficient. It meant that humanity was structural, that the Accord had grown around and through and because of them in ways that could not be removed without the whole thing becoming something different. The vote was unanimous, all 47 species. Thessari was found on her neutral station by a young human diplomat named Eli, 24 years old and 6 months out of the academy. He had been sent to officially close her asylum file, which had been sitting open for decades. He brought a small bag of fruit from Earth because someone at the office had said she had mentioned once that she liked it. She was very old now, Her 4 eyes were almost fully clouded. She moved slowly, and her blue skin had gone almost gray. She sat in a chair near the station's single viewport, and looked out at the stars, the way old beings sometimes look at things they have been watching for a long time. Eli gave her the fruit. Then he asked, because he was young and genuinely curious, why she had given the warning all those years ago. Not what the warning said, why she had given it. She was quiet for a while. She said that she had once watched a human child, very small, fall down a short cliff on a hiking path near a city called Cape Town. The fall was long enough to be scary. The child had hit the ground and lain still for a moment, and every adult nearby had gone cold with fear. Then the child had lifted her head, and she had laughed. Not cried, not screamed, laughed. As if the falling had been the point, as if the ground was just the next part of the game. I knew then, Thesari said, that whatever that species hit, it was not going to stay down. I knew it was going to get back up and go further than it had before. That is not a warning against a dangerous species. That is a warning about an unstoppable one. Eli smiled. He said he thought that sounded like a good thing. Thesari looked at him for a long time. Then she looked back out the viewport, toward the far, dark edge of known space, where the outer veils began, where the Solon had retreated and gone silent. Yes, she said quietly, it is a good thing. I know that now. She paused. It is also the reason I have spent 40 years as far from human space as I could get and still watch. Eli did not fully understand that. He was young. He thanked her and said goodbye and went back to his ship. At the edge of the outer veils, in a place that was not on any official Accord map, there was a small human monitoring station. 8 crew members. Long shifts. Cold coffee from a machine that had stopped making hot coffee 3 months ago, and nobody had fixed, because honestly, the cold version was fine. The crew had named the station Patience, which their regulations did not require and their supervisors had not asked for. They had also named the coffee machine Gerald. Every day, for years, they watched the dark beyond the border. They ran their instruments. They filed their reports. They talked to each other and argued about small things and laughed about those arguments and ate together and watched each other's backs in the way people do when they are far from home and trust each other completely. Nothing came out of the dark. Not yet. But they were watching. They were patient. They were warm. And they were ready. And they were not going anywhere. And if something did come back out of that long dark, it would find them exactly where they had always been. Right there at the edge, steady and smiling, waiting to see what came next.